Hello and welcome to Unit 5, Nervous System, Day 3. Today's aim is how do parts of our body communicate? So we are talking about communication within the nervous system. So we know that this is quick electrical and chemical signals. So our nervous system is our body's fast communication system. And how does our nervous system actually communicate? Well, we can look here at two different nerve cells, which hopefully you remember are called neurons. And when we're looking at the neuron, we can see here we have the body, right? And so because this is a cell, that little dot there is exactly what you think it is. That's the nucleus. So that's the body. That is the largest part of the neuron itself. And when it sends a signal from that area to the next neuron, that signal, typically in the form of a neurotransmitter, our body's electrochemical messengers that communicate or send messages from one nerve cell to another, or impulses, as they're called, right? They're electrical impulses. One that sends one to another, it sends them through this area, this little gap called the synapse. And so when nerve cell A releases the neurotransmitters into the synapse, they are received at this area 1. And you might recall from when we started talking about the nervous system, the part that receives the message is called the receptor site, right? So area 1 is the receptor. And what is the molecule that binds to area 1, right? That is the neurotransmitter. So the neurotransmitter binds to the receptor site. And we're going to see a similar relationship in the endocrine system, which is our body's slow chemical communication system that typically communicates through hormones. So now for another little review. Using the word link below, list the steps of the reflex arc in order. So we have here effector, interneuron, receptor, motor neuron, and sensory neuron. So we're going to start just like we did here, looking at the communication between the two neurons with the initial receptor, right? So the receptor, in the case of the reflex arc, the receptor is going to be in one of our sensory areas, meaning the receptor is going to be in our skin, touch, and our nose, smell, and our ears, sound, and our mouth, taste. It's going to be one of the 5 senses. So that receptor receives a signal. And in the case of a reflex, right, that's usually pain. So like, ooh, I touched the hot stove. So, and you see, I did it that quickly, right? The receptor, when I touch the hot stove, we're going to slow this right down, right? Because remember, our nervous system is quick communication. So as soon as I touch this, it's so hot. So I touch, and that is the receptor receiving the signal that this is hot. Then, and remember, again, this is happening instantaneously. The receptor site receives this pain and sends it to the sensory neuron, which is perceiving this pain, okay? Then, after the sensory neuron is the interneuron. The interneurons are considered part of the central nervous system. So this is the brief period where the reflex, which remember bypasses the brain, right? We're going through all of these steps and we're never reaching the brain. Why is that? That's because this is a reflex. However, the interneurons are part of the central nervous system. So this is the activation of the central nervous system within a reflex, right? But those interneurons are they're between the sensory neurons and the motor neurons that are actually going to move my hand off the hot stove. So the motor neurons activate motion, and then finally, the receptor receives the signal, the effector affects the action. And this all happens within seconds. So fast. All right. So that's our brief little review of the reflex arc. Let's go on to part A, divisions of the nervous system. And we've already talked about this in class, but as we know, the central nervous system is central to the body, right? We have here the brain and the spinal cord. And the brain and the spinal cord that go down the center of the body there, the center of the whole organism. If you were to split you in half, that's the line you would do it down. That is the brain and spinal cord. Then our peripheral nervous system is exactly what it sounds like, right? It's everything on the periphery, everything outside of the central to the sides. And you can see here all these lines. These are all, they might look like blood vessels or bones, but that's really just because there are so many of them. They run along all these different parts of our bodies because our nerves receive signals and also send signals, right? So this is how all the parts of our bodies are coordinated. This is how I'm able to move both of my hands at the same time, right? Thank you, nervous system. So the peripheral nervous system contains the sensory and motor neurons, right? Because this is actually moving and feeling, because the peripheral nervous system is what is actually touching different parts of the body. And you can see that by the lines that go, and even down to the little tips of your fingers, there are nerves here, right? If you can feel it, there's a nerve there. All right, so now zeroing in on everyone's favorite part of the central nervous system, let's talk a little bit about parts of the brain. So parts of the brain, there are entire courses, like many courses that you could take in an anatomy class as a medical student, if you wanted to be a neurologist, psych-based courses on the brain. So we're just going to be doing a general overview of these three important parts of the brain, but it is very important to remember that the brain is extremely, extremely, extremely advanced, and we're only just touching the surface here in living environment. And my favorite part whenever you learn about the brain is your brain is learning about your brain. Wow, isn't that fun? So our brain. We have here three parts that we're going to focus on. The medulla, or the brainstem, famously quoted in the movie Waterboy as what makes the alligator so angry, is the medulla oblongata, and we'll talk about why that is. The cerebellum, which you can see here is also in the posterior or back part of the brain. And then here, the cerebrum, which is at the front of the brain, right? So the cerebrum versus the cerebellum is involved in balance. So that's how I usually remember the difference between cerebrum versus cerebellum, that has an extra B sound in there. But your cerebrum is the largest part of your brain, and that is the thinking part of your brain. This includes the cortices, which are on the outside layer of the brain, and also the lobes of the brain, right? Your frontal lobe, your occipital lobe, you may have heard of these different things. We're not going to talk about the lobes here today, but all of those are included in the cerebrum. So most of the things that you probably conceptualize your brain doing happen in the cerebrum. So it is composed of the right and left hemispheres. So it's divided into two halves, sort of look like this. And the right and left hemispheres are split by a line down the middle called the corpus callosum. And the function of the corpus callosum and its connectivity between the different parts of the brain has been theorized to be involved in conditions like ADD and other attention problems. And if you sever the corpus callosum, so if you cut the line between the two different sides of the brain, all sorts of interesting things start to happen to the individual. Which speaks to a little bit of why the term mad scientist came around, because that's the sort of thing scientists used to do to people. Let's cut their brain in half and see what happens. And we will watch a short little video about someone that had something very similar to that happen to their brains in class. But we won't do that during this YouTube video. So the cerebrum has the right and left hemispheres, which are joined by that line down the middle of the corpus callosum. The functions of the cerebrum are vast, right? Because this includes all of the lobes of our brain and many of the glands that are included within our brain as well. But let's just say a few here. So functions include initiation of movement or action, sensing temperature, fine touch, reasoning, judgment, vision, hearing, problem solving, emotions, and learning. So again, the short way to think about this part of the brain, it is the thinking part of the brain. Now to the cerebellum. And I already told you guys, I like to think about this as the balance center. And it does other things, but that is what the cerebellum is. So you can see here the cerebellum is in the back part of the brain. And the term cerebellum is Latin for little brain. It is a major structure of the hindbrain. Obviously, that is the back part of the brain. But you can see here how the brain is sort of this back part and then this top part that looks much more sophisticated. Well, we're not going to get too much into this, but this part of the brain is older. So it evolved back further in history. And in particular, this lower part of the hindbrain, the medulla, is often referred to as the lizard brain. So this is also why we call the cerebrum the thinking part of the brain, because other animals have a cerebellum and a medulla just like us. So what does the cerebellum actually do? It is responsible for coordinating voluntary movements. So your cerebrum will have the idea, let's start running, and initiate you running. And then your cerebellum will keep you going. And these are voluntary movements, right? So they're controlled. So motor skills, especially fine motor skills, actions like dancing, playing sports, running. And again, this goes into balance, bellum, or movement. And the cerebellum is the movement part of the brain. And, you know, balance is part of movement. Now the medulla, the oldest part of the brain, which is why it's called the lizard brain, it controls base functions, controls involuntary or autonomic. So you can think of that as automatic, but autonomic actions, which include regulating things like your heartbeat, blood pressure, vascular and arterial contractions, carrying messages between the spinal cord and the brain due to its position in the back of the brain, and other involuntary actions, which include vomiting, swallowing, sneezing, etc. So basically, things that your body does without you thinking about it are controlled by the medulla oblongata. And this is where the very interesting sort of, if any of you have seen the movie Waterboy, you probably know what I'm talking about, but it's an old movie with Adam Sandler. And, why does an alligator get so angry? We're talking about a lizard. It gets so angry because it does not have the thinking part of its brain. So this is why this is traditionally referred to as the lizard brain. The idea being here that animals do not have conscious control of their actions and they're acting on instinct. The term instinct is debatable, but you can think of some of the things that the medulla does as on instinct, right? Extreme anger, extreme fear can come from the medulla, but there are also other glands and parts of the brain, the limbic system, that are more involved in those specific like fear, anger, instinct responses. Typically, especially in living environment, you want to think of the medulla or the brainstem as being the involuntary part of your brain that controls these autonomic actions. Again, breathing, heart rate, sneezing, vomiting, in general, things that you do but don't control. All right, so we're going to skip this little video and we're going to watch this during class. But Phineas Gage is a very famous example of a brain injury, and his brain injury taught neurologists so much about what that part of the brain that he injured actually does. It's really fascinating. It's a SciShow clip, so feel free to watch it now, but we're going to watch it during class. All right, and we're going to talk briefly about these disorders of the nervous system, and we're also going to cover more disorders of the nervous system when we do the Yo homeostasis presentations in February. So, all right, cerebral palsy is a disorder in which damage has occurred to the motor neurons, making it difficult for movement to occur, especially in the limbs. So you can see here, right, the motor neurons are these parts of your nervous system that are peripheral. They're close to the parts of your body that they are controlling, right? So in the case of cerebral palsy, this usually occurs at birth due to injury, right? It can happen in utero or during birth, during partum. So what that means is the range of, it says here, range from mild to severe, depends upon the injury. If you've ever seen the show Breaking Bad, the son, Walt Jr. has cerebral palsy and he walks with canes. If you've ever seen the comedian Josh Blue, he's a stand-up comedian. He doesn't walk with any canes, although he does have like a disability. He walks differently, atypically. But he is a stand-up comedian, so he is able to do that job, even though he has this condition. However, some people with cerebral palsy cannot walk at all, and they may be bound to a wheelchair. So it's a very large range, and it is to note here that it is due to some sort of an injury, either during pregnancy or at birth. So interesting there, and also very sad for those affected. Polio, a little different. Polio is an infectious disease. Fortunately, not something that we are familiar with today, but just to give you an idea, my grandfather, and I'm only about 14 years older than you guys. My grandfather had polio when he was a child. So polio was something that was around not that long ago, within the 20th century. And it was extremely common. So polio was caused by the polio virus. It attacks the central nervous system, usually resulting in paralysis, either partial paralysis or total paralysis, which can lead to immobility. The vaccine for polio was developed by Jonas Salk in 1953, which he famously refused to patent. Because of these developments, polio has been virtually eradicated in the entire world. And all of us here have all received a polio vaccine. In order to attend any public school in New York City or in the United States, you must be vaccinated from polio. And you receive polio vaccinations as a baby in your initial boosters and also at your 2-year and 4-year boosters. So we take the polio vaccine very seriously. And it asks here, do you think it's a good idea to vaccinate people for polio? Why or why not? I would say yes. And why is that? Well, it's because the potential complications from the polio vaccine, which I have never heard of any, pale in comparison to the effects of polio, which again can include paralysis. Ooh, hold on. Where's that word? I lost it. Paralysis. Not good. You don't want to be paralyzed, even if you just have partial paralysis of one muscle in your body. Remember, when we're maintaining homeostasis of the entire body, if one part of your body has been completely immobilized, that limits the rest of your body's ability to actually maintain that stable internal environment because it's always compensating for that injury. So yes, it's a good idea to vaccinate people from polio to prevent the spread of a deadly illness. This is why vaccines are one of the most important technological innovations ever. Not just of the 20th century, not just of the 21st century, ever, 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 ever. Vaccines have saved billions of lives, and actually more than we can ever even calculate because of all of the people that were born on Earth that never would have been born because their parents and grandparents were vaccinated. Get your shots, kids, and don't believe everything you read on the internet. That's all I have for you today. This was Nervous System Day 3. Today's aim was how do parts of our body communicate? And we talked about the central nervous system, the peripheral nervous system, parts of the brain, and disorders of the nervous system. And with that, we have finished the nervous system, and we will move on to our next body system tomorrow. All right, guys, have a super fantastic day. Don't forget to complete your exit ticket, and I'll see you all tomorrow on Zoom. Bye.